On the afternoon of May 11th, 1979, a woman lay dying in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills. Outside, life carried on as usual. Luxury cars rolled down Wilshire Boulevard. Tourists wandered past storefronts filled with jewelry worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The city that had celebrated wealth, beauty, and celebrity barely noticed that one of the richest women in modern history was taking her final breaths. Barbara Hutton was 66 years old. By then, much of the fortune that had once made her one of the wealthiest women on earth had disappeared. Years of extravagant spending, failed investments, generous gifts, and costly divorces had consumed hundreds of millions of dollars. Her health had deteriorated after decades of prescription drug dependence, repeated surgeries, and chronic illness. She had married 7 times. She had lived in palaces. She had worn some of the world's most famous jewels. She had entertained royalty, presidents, movie stars, and business tycoons. Yet when people looked back on her life, they rarely spoke first about her fortune. They remembered the sadness. For nearly half a century, newspapers around the world had called her by a nickname she never escaped: the poor little rich girl. It sounded like the title of a fairy tale. In reality, it was closer to a tragedy, because Barbara Hutton's story was never really about money. It was about loneliness. It was about a little girl who inherited unimaginable wealth before she was old enough to understand what it meant. A girl who grew into a woman surrounded by people, but never entirely certain who truly loved her. How does someone born into extraordinary privilege spend an entire lifetime searching for happiness? To answer that question, we have to begin decades earlier, inside one of the greatest retail empires America had ever built. Long before Walmart, long before Target, long before shopping malls reshaped the suburbs, there was Woolworth. In the late 19th century, Frank Winfield Woolworth transformed American retail by proving that ordinary people would flock to stores where prices were simple, affordable, and clearly marked. His famous 5 and 10-cent stores spread across the United States and eventually around the world. What began as a modest business grew into a commercial empire. By the time Woolworth died in 1919, his fortune ranked among the largest in America. His company employed tens of thousands of people, and its stores welcomed millions of customers every year. The family name became synonymous with wealth. Barbara Hutton would inherit that wealth, but she would never know the man who created it. She was born on November 14th, 1912, in New York City. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, was a successful stockbroker whose career placed him among the financial elite of Wall Street. Her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, was one of Frank Woolworth's daughters and therefore an heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country. From the moment Barbara entered the world, newspapers treated her less like a child than a future heiress. Writers speculated about the fortune she might one day inherit. Society columns followed her family. Photographers captured images that transformed private moments into public curiosity. She had done nothing. She had achieved nothing. Yet the world had already decided that Barbara Hutton mattered because of the money attached to her name. Behind the elegant homes and expensive clothes, however, the Hutton household was far from peaceful. Barbara's parents struggled through an increasingly unhappy marriage. Arguments became common. Affection became scarce. Friends later described a relationship strained by incompatible personalities and growing emotional distance. For a young child, home should be the safest place in the world. For Barbara, it became a place of uncertainty. Then, before she reached her 6th birthday, tragedy struck. In 1917, Edna Woolworth Hutton died by suicide. Barbara was only 5 years old. The loss shattered the family. Exactly how much Barbara understood at the time is impossible to know. Children often struggle to comprehend death. They understand only absence. One day someone is there, the next day they are gone, and for the rest of their lives, they quietly wonder why. In later years, biographers would point to this moment as one of the defining tragedies of Barbara's life. While we cannot know precisely how it shaped her emotionally, losing a parent so young is widely recognized as a profound childhood trauma. The emotional wound remained. Her father eventually remarried and continued his demanding career, but Barbara's upbringing increasingly fell into the hands of governesses, tutors, servants, and boarding schools. She received the finest education money could provide, the finest clothes, the finest homes, the finest vacations. But children measure love differently. Not by the size of a bedroom, not by the number of servants, not by the value of an inheritance. They measure it in time, attention, affection, security. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. These were things that no fortune could guarantee. As Barbara grew older, she became one of the most recognizable young heiresses in America. Reporters followed her movements. Society magazines analyzed her appearance. Every birthday seemed to bring new estimates of the fortune she would one day control. Adults discussed millions of dollars, while the child at the center of those conversations quietly searched for something much smaller. Someone who loved Barbara. Not Barbara Hutton, not the Woolworth Fortune, just Barbara. She could not have known it then. But that search, for genuine affection in a world fascinated by her wealth, would define almost every major decision she made for the rest of her life. It would shape her friendships, it would shape her marriages, and it would eventually earn her a place in history that no amount of money could ever erase. The richest little girl in America was about to discover that enormous wealth attracts many people, but not all of them come for the right reasons. By the time Barbara Hutton reached her teenage years, she had become something few people in history have ever experienced. She was famous without having accomplished anything. She had never starred in a film, never written a book, never won an election, never discovered an invention, yet newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic followed her life with relentless fascination. The reason was simple. She was expected to inherit one of the largest private fortunes in America, and everyone wanted a glimpse of the girl who would one day control it. The attention intensified as she grew older. Photographers waited outside family homes. Society reporters described her dresses in painstaking detail. Columnists speculated about her future, her education, and eventually, the man she might marry. Barbara was still trying to discover who she was. The world had already decided who she should become. For wealthy families of the era, there was an established path into high society. Young women from prominent families were formally introduced to society at lavish debutante balls, where they were presented to the social elite. It was less about celebration than expectation. A successful debut announced that a young woman had entered adulthood. For Barbara Hutton, it became an international spectacle. In 1930, at just 17 years old, she attended what newspapers described as one of the most extravagant debutante celebrations America had ever seen. The Great Depression had begun only months earlier. Across the United States, banks were collapsing. Factories were closing. Millions of families were losing jobs, savings, and homes. Breadlines stretched through city streets. Yet inside New York's glittering ballrooms, another America seemed to exist entirely untouched by hardship. Guests arrived wearing diamonds that reflected the light of enormous crystal chandeliers. Orchestras played late into the evening. Champagne flowed freely. Every detail had been designed to communicate extraordinary wealth. Reporters estimated that the celebration cost a fortune at a time when many Americans struggled to afford their next meal. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Almost overnight, Barbara became one of the most recognizable young women in the country. Some admired her, others envied her. Many criticized the extravagant display during such desperate economic times. Barbara herself had not created the Great Depression. She had not organized the celebration alone. Yet public opinion rarely distinguishes between symbol and individual. She became the symbol. From that moment forward, Barbara Hutton was no longer simply a wealthy heiress. She had become America's most eligible woman. The attention brought an entirely new problem. People began entering her life with motives that were increasingly difficult to judge. Invitations multiplied, so did admirers. European aristocrats, businessmen, socialites, and ambitious young men suddenly found reasons to cross her path. Some undoubtedly admired Barbara herself. Others saw something else: access, status, security, an inheritance unlike almost any other. The challenge for Barbara was that those motives often looked identical at first. A compliment sounded sincere, whether it came from genuine affection or calculated ambition. A gift could be generous or strategic. A declaration of love could be heartfelt or carefully rehearsed. For someone who had lost her mother in childhood and spent years longing for emotional security, distinguishing between those possibilities became extraordinarily difficult. Biographers have frequently noted that Barbara craved approval. She wanted to be liked, wanted to belong, wanted to believe that someone might see beyond the Woolworth Fortune. Whether those hopes made her unusually trusting is a matter of interpretation. What cannot be disputed is that many people around her understood exactly how lonely she was. Loneliness has a peculiar effect. It doesn't merely make companionship desirable, it makes it urgent, and urgency often clouds judgment. Barbara also found herself confronting another challenge: beauty. Society magazines celebrated her appearance constantly. Fashion designers competed to dress her. Jewelry houses loaned her spectacular pieces. Portrait photographers transformed her into an icon of glamour. The world looked at Barbara and saw perfection. Barbara looked into the mirror and often saw someone else. Friends later described periods of deep insecurity about her appearance. Throughout her life, she would undergo numerous cosmetic procedures in search of an ideal that always seemed just beyond reach. It became another pattern. The more the public admired her, the less convinced she seemed. As the years passed, enormous wealth became both her greatest privilege and her greatest obstacle. It opened every door, but it also raised an impossible question. If someone entered Barbara's life, was it because of her, or because of the fortune waiting behind her name? There was no reliable way to know, and that uncertainty followed her everywhere. By the early 1930s, Europe still clung to the fading glamour of old aristocracy. Many noble families retained famous titles, but possessed far less money than they once had. At the same time, America had produced a new kind of wealth: industrial fortunes, banking fortunes, retail fortunes, families with enormous financial power, but without centuries-old titles. To some European nobles, the solution seemed obvious: marry American money. For wealthy American heiresses, marrying into European nobility promised something equally attractive: prestige, romance, a title. The image of becoming a princess or countess captivated the public imagination. Barbara Hutton would soon find herself at the center of exactly that world. She was barely in her 20s when a handsome European prince entered her life. He possessed impeccable manners, an aristocratic title, an adventurous reputation, and exactly the sort of charm that newspapers adored. His name was Prince Alexis Midivani. To much of the world, he appeared to be everything a fairy tale romance required. But fairy tales rarely survive contact with reality. For Barbara, this would become the beginning of a painful pattern. She believed she had finally found love. History would remember it as the first of 7 marriages. By the early 1930s, Barbara Hutton had become one of the most sought-after women in the world. Not because people knew her well, but because they knew what her last name represented. The Woolworth Fortune had made her a symbol of unimaginable wealth at a time when much of the world was struggling through the Great Depression. Newspapers followed her every public appearance. Society pages chronicled every dress she wore, every gala she attended, and every rumor surrounding her private life. The attention was relentless. And somewhere amid that whirlwind, Barbara met a man who seemed to offer everything she believed she had been missing. His name was Prince Alexis Midivani. Tall, elegant, and impeccably dressed, Alexis belonged to a Georgian noble family that had become famous across Europe for marrying wealthy American heiresses. The Midivani siblings were glamorous, sophisticated, and well-connected. They moved effortlessly through royal courts, luxury hotels, and the drawing rooms of the international elite. To the public, Alexis looked like a fairy tale prince. To Barbara, he looked like someone who finally saw her as more than a bank account. Their romance developed quickly, perhaps too quickly. Friends expressed quiet concern that Barbara barely knew the man she was preparing to marry, but concerns carried little weight against the excitement surrounding what newspapers called one of the society weddings of the decade. In June 1933, Barbara Hutton married Prince Alexis Medivani in Paris. The ceremony attracted enormous international attention. Reporters crowded outside. Photographers fought for the perfect image. Articles described the bride's gown, the jewels she wore, and the distinguished guests who attended. It seemed like the perfect ending to every story the newspapers had been writing since Barbara was a little girl. America's richest heiress had married a prince. The fairy tale, however, began to unravel almost immediately. Alexis was accustomed to an extravagant lifestyle: luxury hotels, private servants, expensive automobiles, exclusive clubs. Maintaining that image required enormous amounts of money. Barbara possessed plenty of it. Whether Alexis truly loved Barbara has been debated by historians for decades. No one can know another person's private feelings with certainty. What is well documented, however, is that financial disagreements emerged early in the marriage. Barbara found herself paying for an increasingly lavish way of life. The gifts became more expensive, the expectations became greater, and the emotional distance between husband and wife continued to grow. The dream she had imagined since childhood, that marriage would finally provide the stable, loving family she had never known, began slipping away. It was a painful realization. Money had opened every door, but it had not solved the one problem she had hoped it would. After barely 2 years together, the marriage collapsed. In 1935, Barbara and Alexis divorced. The headlines were predictably sensational. Another failed romance, another scandal among the rich, another chapter for the gossip columns. For reporters, it was entertaining copy. For Barbara, it was something much more personal. It was confirmation of one of her deepest fears, that even marriage could not guarantee the love she had spent her life searching for. Most people would have stepped away from public attention after such a painful experience. Barbara did the opposite. She threw herself back into the glamorous world that had surrounded her since childhood. She attended parties in Paris, dined with European aristocrats, vacationed on luxurious yachts, appeared at society events where photographers documented every smile. From the outside, her life looked enviable. Inside, the loneliness remained. Not long after her divorce, another man entered her life. This one carried an impressive title as well. Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow was a Danish nobleman, handsome, confident, and every bit as charming as the prince who had come before him. Friends hoped this relationship might be different. Barbara certainly hoped so. The two married in 1935, only months after her first marriage ended. Unlike her first husband, Kurt appeared interested in building a quieter family life. Soon after the wedding, Barbara gave birth to her only child, a son named Lance Reventlow. For the first time, she experienced a kind of happiness that had nothing to do with wealth or status. Holding her son, Barbara reportedly became deeply devoted to motherhood. Barb. Many biographers believe Lance became the emotional center of her world. She wanted to give him something she herself had lost so early in life: a sense of security, a loving home, a mother who would always be there. But even this new beginning carried shadows. The marriage to Count Reventlow gradually became strained. Accounts from friends and historians describe increasing tension, arguments, and controlling behavior within the relationship. Their private lives became the subject of public speculation, as nearly every disagreement risked becoming tomorrow's newspaper headline. Barbara once again found herself trapped between appearances and reality. The public still saw luxury, palaces, titles, jewels. They did not see the growing unhappiness behind closed doors. It was becoming a pattern that would define much of her life. Each new marriage began with genuine hope. Each promised a fresh start. Each seemed, for a brief moment, to offer the emotional security she had longed for since childhood, and each ended with the same heartbreaking question. If love couldn't be found in a palace, if it couldn't be found beside a prince or a count, where could it be found at all? Barbara Hutton did not yet know it, but the most famous husband of her life was still waiting. His name was Cary Grant, and unlike the aristocrats before him, he was already one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. By the early 1940s, Barbara Hutton had lived through 2 failed marriages. She had been a princess. She had been a countess. She had become a mother. And despite every title, every palace, and every fortune that surrounded her, the feeling she had been chasing since childhood remained just beyond her reach. Love still seemed temporary. Trust still felt uncertain. The world, however, saw something entirely different. To the public, Barbara Hutton was the embodiment of glamour. Magazine covers celebrated her wardrobe. Newspapers reported on her travels. Photographers captured images of a woman who appeared to possess everything anyone could ever desire. But appearances have always been one of history's greatest illusions. Behind the carefully posed photographs was someone who increasingly questioned whether genuine affection could survive extraordinary wealth. Then Hollywood entered the picture. His name was Cary Grant. Unlike the titled aristocrats Barbara had married before, Grant came from humble beginnings. Born Archibald Leach in Bristol, England, he had grown up in poverty, experienced a difficult childhood, and reinvented himself through determination and extraordinary charisma. By the early 1940s, he was one of the biggest stars in American cinema. Handsome, elegant, effortlessly charming. He seemed, at least on paper, like the opposite of the European nobleman who had disappointed Barbara. Their relationship attracted enormous attention from the moment it became public. Hollywood had found its dream couple, America's richest heiress, Hollywood's leading man. For newspapers, it was irresistible. For Barbara, it represented another chance to believe that happiness might finally be within reach. The two married in July 1942. Unlike some of Barbara's previous weddings, this one carried a different atmosphere. Friends later remarked that the relationship appeared more relaxed and affectionate. Grant was known for his wit and professionalism rather than extravagant displays of wealth. Perhaps because he had experienced financial hardship himself, he reportedly felt uncomfortable relying on Barbara's fortune. In fact, throughout their marriage, Cary Grant repeatedly insisted on maintaining his own financial independence. Years later, Barbara herself acknowledged that Grant had not pursued her for money, a distinction she did not make about every man who entered her life. That alone made him unusual. The marriage unfolded during one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. The Second World War touched nearly every aspect of daily life. Hollywood contributed to the war effort through films, fundraising events, and performances for military personnel. Public attention shifted away from society gossip toward global conflict. For a brief period, Barbara and Cary were able to enjoy something approaching normality. They traveled together, hosted friends, attempted to build a quieter domestic life away from constant speculation. Yet even relationships founded on genuine affection can struggle under extraordinary pressure. Cary Grant's acting career demanded long periods away from home. Barbara's health had begun to decline. She experienced recurring medical problems that required treatment and increasingly relied on prescription medications prescribed by physicians, a common practice in an era when the long-term risks of many drugs were not fully understood. The emotional wounds she carried from childhood had never completely healed. Money had protected her from financial hardship. It had never protected her from loneliness. By 1945, after 3 years of marriage, Barbara and Cary Grant decided to divorce. Unlike several of Barbara's other marriages, the separation remained remarkably civil. There were no explosive courtroom battles, no sensational accusations dominating newspaper headlines, no prolonged public hostility. Grant later spoke respectfully about Barbara, and many historians continue to regard him as one of the few husbands who genuinely cared for her well-being. Their marriage simply could not survive the realities of their lives. For Barbara, however, Another divorce carried a familiar emotional weight. It was another promise that had ended, another future she had imagined disappearing before her eyes. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Each relationship began with hope, each ended with disappointment. And after every ending, Barbara seemed to believe that the next marriage would finally succeed where the others had failed. Psychologists often caution against explaining a person's entire life through a single event or trauma. Human beings are far more complicated than that. Yet it is difficult to overlook one recurring theme in Barbara Hutton's life. From the loss of her mother in early childhood to the emotional distance she often experienced growing up, she spent decades searching for a sense of security that always seemed just out of reach. Marriage became one way of searching. Generosity became another. She gave lavish gifts to friends, supported charitable causes, helped people in need. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Those who knew her often described her as remarkably generous. Sometimes, critics argued, too generous for her own good. The fortune she had inherited seemed almost limitless. But limitless wealth has a way of creating limitless expectations. People asked for loans, investments, expensive presents, financial assistance. Some requests came from genuine friends. Others came from people who understood exactly how difficult Barbara found it to refuse. The line between kindness and exploitation grew increasingly blurred. As the years passed, the empire she had inherited slowly began to shrink. Not overnight, not through a single reckless decision, but through decades of extraordinary spending, expensive divorces, taxes, maintaining multiple homes, supporting a vast staff, and living a lifestyle few people on Earth could afford indefinitely. Still, Barbara remained convinced that happiness was waiting somewhere just beyond the next chapter. She would marry again, and again, each time believing that this new beginning might finally become the lasting one. History, unfortunately, had other plans, because the greatest heartbreak of Barbara Hutton's life was not waiting in another marriage. It was waiting in the life of the person she loved more than anyone else, her only son. Lance Reventlow. Of all the titles Barbara Hutton carried throughout her life, heiress, princess, countess, socialite, none meant more to her than one simple word: mother. Her son, Lance Reventlow, had become the emotional center of her world. Unlike the fortune she had inherited, unlike the jewels she collected, unlike the husbands who came and went, Lance represented something permanent. He was family. Barbara devoted enormous attention to him throughout his childhood. She wanted him to grow up with opportunities she had enjoyed, but without the emotional emptiness that had often accompanied her own upbringing. She encouraged his interests, supported his ambitions, protected him from the relentless attention that had followed her since childhood. For a time, it seemed she had succeeded. As he grew older, Lance developed a passion that had little to do with high society: automobile racing. It was a dangerous sport, but it offered something he valued deeply: independence. Rather than living forever in the shadow of the Woolworth Fortune, Lance wanted to build a reputation of his own. He competed as a racing driver and later founded Reventlow Automobiles Incorporated, better known as RAI. His goal was ambitious: to build American race cars capable of challenging the best manufacturers in Europe. It was an expensive dream. Barbara quietly helped finance parts of the venture, as she often supported the people she loved. Watching her son pursue his own path brought her genuine pride. For perhaps the first time in years, she believed that something good might finally endure. But life had rarely been kind to Barbara Hutton, and it was about to become even crueler. On July 24, 1972, Lance Reventlow boarded a small aircraft near Aspen, Colorado. He was traveling on business. Shortly after takeoff, tragedy struck. The aircraft crashed. Lance was killed instantly. He was only 36 years old. For Barbara, the news was devastating. Friends later described her as emotionally shattered. She had survived failed marriages, public humiliation, years of loneliness. But nothing had prepared her for losing her only child. Parents often expect to leave this world before their children. Barbara faced the opposite reality. She was forced to bury the person she had hoped would outlive her. Those close to her noticed a profound change afterward. The optimism that had occasionally resurfaced throughout her life seemed to disappear. She became increasingly withdrawn. Medical problems worsened. Her dependence on prescription medication deepened. By the 1970s, Barbara's health had become a constant concern. Years of surgeries, chronic pain, and powerful medications had taken a visible toll. Her once famous beauty faded beneath illness. Walking became difficult. Public appearances became rare. The glamorous photographs that had once filled magazine covers belonged to another era. At the same time, another quiet transformation was taking place. The fortune that had once seemed almost limitless was steadily shrinking. For decades, newspapers had portrayed Barbara as someone who simply spent without restraint. The reality was more complicated. She certainly lived extravagantly. She owned magnificent homes across several countries. She purchased priceless jewelry. She traveled by private yacht and maintained a lifestyle few could imagine. But wealth also flowed outward in less visible ways. Expensive divorces, heavy taxes, maintenance of enormous estates, generous gifts to friends and relatives, support for charitable causes, financial assistance to people who approached her in moments of need. Some historians argue that Barbara was often too trusting. Others believe she became an easy target for opportunists who recognized both her generosity and her emotional vulnerability. Whatever the explanation, the result was unmistakable. The empire she had inherited no longer resembled the fortune that had once astonished the world. Yet Barbara herself seemed increasingly indifferent to the numbers. Money had never solved the problems that mattered most. It had not brought back her mother. It had not guaranteed lasting marriages. And now, it could not bring back her son. In many ways, Lance's death marked the point at which Barbara stopped searching for a happier future. The hope that had sustained her through decades of disappointment slowly gave way to resignation. Friends still visited. Family members remained close. But those who knew her sensed that an essential part of her spirit had disappeared. The little girl who had spent a lifetime searching for love had suffered one final heartbreak, and after that, there seemed very little left to search for. The world still remembered Barbara Hutton as one of history's richest women. It would soon discover how lonely that wealth had become. The final chapter of her life was approaching, and it would leave behind a legacy far more complicated than anyone had imagined. By the late 1970s, Barbara Hutton had become almost unrecognizable from the glamorous young heiress who had once dominated newspaper front pages around the world. The jewels were still famous, the family name was still legendary, but the woman herself had largely disappeared from public life. Years of declining health had taken their toll. Chronic medical problems required frequent treatment. Prescription medications that had once been intended to ease pain gradually became a permanent part of daily life. Repeated surgeries left her physically weaker, and friends noticed that she tired easily. The transformation was striking. The woman who had once danced in Europe's grandest ballrooms now spent much of her time seeking something far simpler: comfort, privacy, peace. Many of the people who had surrounded her during the height of her fame were no longer there. Some had passed away. Others had drifted into different lives. A few had remained loyal for decades, but the endless parties and extravagant gatherings that had once defined Barbara Hutton's world belonged to another era. Fame has a peculiar way of attracting crowds. Age often reveals who chooses to stay after the spotlight fades. Barbara had spent her entire life wondering whether people loved her or loved what she possessed. By the end of her life, that question mattered less than it once had. She had long since accepted that wealth could open doors, but it could not guarantee loyalty. She divided her remaining years between Europe and the United States, living quietly and avoiding the constant publicity that had followed her since childhood. The headlines became less frequent, and when they did appear, They often focused on estimates of her remaining fortune rather than on the person herself. It was an ironic ending. As a little girl, newspapers had predicted how wealthy she would become. As an older woman, they speculated about how much remained. Rarely did they ask whether she was happy. Throughout her life, Barbara also devoted substantial resources to philanthropy. She supported hospitals, medical research, the arts, and humanitarian causes. Those charitable gifts received far less attention than her jewelry collections or marriages, yet they formed an important part of her legacy. Generosity, after all, had always come naturally to her. Whether that generosity was sometimes taken advantage of remains a question historians continue to discuss. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton died in Beverly Hills at the age of 66. News organizations around the world immediately published obituaries. Almost every headline followed the same familiar formula. The Woolworth heiress. The woman with 7 husbands. The poor little rich girl. The phrases had followed her for decades. Even in death, they remained. Yet reducing Barbara Hutton's life to headlines tells only part of the story. She inherited extraordinary wealth. She also inherited extraordinary expectations. Before she was old enough to make her own decisions, the world had already decided what she represented. To some, she was a symbol of privilege. To others, she was proof that money could never buy happiness. The truth was more complicated. Barbara Hutton was neither simply a victim nor simply a symbol. She made choices, some wise, others deeply flawed. She entered marriages that did not last. She trusted people who disappointed her. She spent freely. She sought affection in places where it could not always be found. Those decisions shaped her life. So did the circumstances she never chose. She did not choose to lose her mother as a child. She did not choose to grow up under relentless public scrutiny. She did not choose the emotional burdens that accompanied one of the greatest inheritances in American history. Perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate. Not because most people can imagine possessing such immense wealth, but because almost everyone understands the desire to be loved for who they are. Barbara Hutton spent decades searching for certainty in a world where nearly every relationship carried a question mark. Was it friendship or opportunity? Love or ambition? Devotion or dependence? There were no easy answers. History has often remembered her as a cautionary tale, a reminder that fortune alone cannot guarantee fulfillment. That lesson remains relevant today. In an age that celebrates celebrity, luxury, and endless displays of success, Barbara Hutton's life asks a timeless question. What is the value of immense wealth if it cannot provide the things that matter most? The answer cannot be measured in dollars. It cannot be displayed in a vault. It cannot be worn around a neck or locked inside a palace. Barbara Hutton inherited one of the greatest fortunes of the 20th century, but the treasure she searched for all her life was invisible. A place to belong, a family that would endure, a love that asked for nothing in return. She spent millions pursuing those dreams. In the end, they remained priceless. And perhaps that is why history remembers her not merely as an heiress, but as one of the most tragic figures of the 20th century. Not because she had everything, but because, despite having almost everything money could buy, she never stopped searching for the one thing it never could. There is an old saying that every fortune comes with a price. For Barbara Hutton, that price was never measured in dollars. It was measured in trust. More than 4 decades after her death, historians still debate many parts of her life. Some remember her as a reckless heiress who spent extraordinary sums of money on luxury, jewels, and failed marriages. Others see a woman who was shaped by profound childhood loss, thrust into a world that valued her inheritance more than her humanity. Perhaps both views contain part of the truth. Barbara Hutton was born into circumstances that almost no one could understand. Before she could decide who she wanted to become, newspapers had already decided who she was. Her fortune became her identity. Her wealth became her reputation. Everywhere she went, introductions came with invisible questions. How much was she worth? Who would she marry next? What would she buy? far fewer people asked a different question. How was she? That distinction matters. History often remembers famous people as symbols rather than human beings. Barbara became a symbol of limitless wealth, just as Howard Hughes became a symbol of eccentric genius, and Marilyn Monroe became a symbol of Hollywood glamour. But symbols do not laugh. They do not grieve. They do not lie awake wondering whether they are truly loved. People do. The Woolworth Fortune itself gradually faded into history. The retail empire that had transformed American shopping eventually disappeared, and many of the magnificent homes, priceless jewels, and extravagant possessions associated with Barbara Hutton passed into museums, auction houses, or private collections. Objects survived. The headlines survived. The photographs survived. What remained far more difficult to preserve was the emotional reality behind them. Today, psychologists often discuss the importance of secure childhood relationships, emotional stability, and genuine human connection. Barbara Hutton lived decades before many of those ideas became widely understood. While no single explanation can account for the choices she made, her life reminds us that emotional wounds do not simply disappear because someone's bank account grows larger. Money can solve many problems. It can provide safety, education, medical care, opportunity. It can open doors that remain closed for others. But it has limits. It cannot erase grief. It cannot repair every broken relationship. And it cannot guarantee that the people surrounding you are there for the right reasons. That may be the most enduring lesson of Barbara Hutton's story. Not that wealth is meaningless. Clearly it is not. Her fortune allowed her to support charitable causes, preserve works of art, help friends and family, and experience a life that most people can scarcely imagine. But wealth was never enough on its own. The things she appeared to seek most, lasting trust, unconditional love, and emotional security, could never be purchased. In the end, Barbara Hutton left behind more than a remarkable fortune and 7 marriages. She left behind a question. If someone gave you everything money could buy, would it be enough? For Barbara Hutton, history's answer seems painfully clear. The grand hotels eventually emptied, the parties ended, the photographers moved on, the jewels found new owners. But the search that defined her life never truly ended. Perhaps that is why her story still resonates today. Not because most of us will ever inherit a fortune, but because nearly all of us understand the desire to be accepted for who we are, rather than for what we possess. Barbara Hutton's life reminds us that behind every famous name is a human story, one filled with hope, disappointment, resilience, and contradiction. She was an heiress, a mother, a philanthropist, a public figure, a woman who experienced extraordinary privilege and extraordinary sorrow in the same lifetime. History will continue to debate her decisions. It should. But beyond the headlines and the gossip, one truth remains difficult to ignore. The little girl who inherited one of the greatest fortunes in America spent her life searching for something far more valuable. And that search continues to make her story unforgettable. History has always been fascinated by numbers. 7 husbands, hundreds of millions of dollars, palaces on multiple continents, jewels that filled museum exhibitions, a fortune so vast that it seemed impossible to spend. Those are the numbers most people remember. But numbers rarely tell the whole story. Behind every headline was a woman who spent her life searching for something that cannot be inherited. The love of a parent, the certainty of trust, the comfort of knowing that someone would remain, even after the money, the fame, and the glamour had faded. Barbara Hutton never stopped believing that the next chapter might finally bring that peace. Perhaps that hope was her greatest strength. Perhaps it was also her greatest vulnerability. History often asks whether money can buy happiness. Barbara Hutton's life suggests a more complicated answer. Money can build magnificent homes, but it cannot guarantee they will feel like home. It can attract attention, but it cannot reveal who truly cares. It can purchase extraordinary beauty, but it cannot heal every invisible wound carried from childhood. That does not make wealth meaningless. Far from it. Money can create opportunity, relieve suffering, and change lives for the better. But Barbara Hutton reminds us that some of life's greatest needs exist beyond the reach of any fortune. Love, trust, belonging. Those are treasures that no inheritance can guarantee. Today, her jewels have new owners. Her mansions belong to someone else. The Woolworth empire that made her famous exists only in history books. But her story continues to endure. Not because she was one of the richest women who ever lived, but because she was one of the clearest reminders that extraordinary success on the outside can coexist with extraordinary loneliness on the inside. Perhaps that is why people still speak her name decades after her death. Not out of envy, not because of the 7 marriages, not even because of the fortune, but because her life asks a timeless question that every generation must answer for itself. What truly makes a life rich? Barbara Hutton spent 66 years searching for that answer. She found wealth beyond imagination. She found fame beyond measure. She found titles, luxury, and admiration from around the world. Whether she found lasting happiness is a question only history can attempt to answer. But her life leaves us with one truth that feels impossible to ignore. The greatest fortunes are not always counted in dollars. Sometimes they are counted in the people who stay when there is nothing left to gain. And perhaps that is the richest inheritance anyone can ever receive. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.